Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Because everything is a little weird this season, we have the convergence of two events in college football this week that would normally be weeks apart. The college football playoff rankings make their debut, and Thanksgiving week also brings a host of rivalry games and a big slate of games scheduled for Black Friday. So it's a big week. To talk about it all, my friend Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic joins me. We'll talk a lot about the playoff and various scenarios, but that comes with an important programming note. Because it's Thanksgiving week, like a lot of folks, we're trying to cram 5 days worth of work into the first 2 or 3 days of the week. We're recording this before the playoff rankings are released. There are a couple of little things that are uncertain about where teams will land, but ultimately we have a pretty good idea about how things will shake out. Nicole and I will dig into what to expect from the rankings, what are the main questions that need to be answered, and what those answers will mean going forward. Plus, we'll get into the Clemson-Florida State postponement and the controversy that came with it. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a good review and a good rating. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is my good friend Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic. It's been a little while since we've had Nicole on the show. She is a recurring guest, but we like to mix it up around here, have a lot of different voices. But I believe this is the first time we've talked since at a point when we weren't sure if there was going to be a season, Nicole. Well, we've had a season. It's been a little ragged, but when we do get to Saturdays, the games are usually pretty good.
Yeah, no, I think, I forget who's been saying this, but if you had told folks back in June that we would have gotten this many games in, I think people would have absolutely taken it and honestly been a little surprised. And I think we understandably do focus on the postponements and cancellations and adjustments to the calendar, but a lot of games have gotten in and we are barreling towards a college football playoff. And honestly, past December 19th, I know, there's New Year's Six games, they're going to try to play some bowl games, but at that point, you only really got to worry about 4 teams. We're getting close to the finish line.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And to a certain degree, one of the things I've tried to get across to people is that in some ways, all of this is window dressing to get to 4 teams, right? I mean, there is, you hate to sort of minimize the games being played because, listen, it is important to the players, and there's a whole bunch of games being played between teams that don't have any national championship or even conference championship hopes that are still important to the players, and the players have gone through a lot this year. The coaches have gone through a lot this year. So it's cool to get them, to see them get to compete. But a lot of it is, again, just sort of like window dressing to get to Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, Notre Dame, maybe, 1 or 2 other teams. And I bring that up because before we get into the playoff talk, because we did talk about, so the raggedness of the season and postponements. Let's look back before we look ahead. I want to get this cleared. Clemson and Florida State were postponed. The latest we've seen a game postponed, hours before kickoff. The Clemson and Florida State could not agree on whether it was safe to play. Clemson said, yes, we should play, even though we have this player who, traveled with the team who ended up testing positive. Florida State didn't like that information and said, no, they shouldn't play. And it's become a thing. It's become a controversy. And Dabo didn't exactly take the high road. I'm wondering what your sort of takeaway from this whole mess, Nicole.
Yeah, I don't have, I guess I could have had hotter takes, but at this point, it's so frustrating when people try to blame people, or even protocols in some way, unless people are like blatantly trying to do things on purpose, skirt rules, whatever. Because to me, this is a pandemic. It's the worst it's been this whole time right now. It's cold. People are indoors more. And we still don't know everything. Like, we're still learning about the virus on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So everyone's trying to do the best that they can. So it bothers me when you have programs or fan bases accusing people of trying to duck opponents, or whatever this was in this case, because it's almost nonsensical to me, to be honest, because the positive case was in Clemson's program. And so, like, there is potential spread in Clemson's program, yet they're mad at Florida State for saying, hey, we're not sure about this. Like, we don't want to put our players at risk, but Clemson should be concerned about their own players as well, right? So, like, and also how you get to a situation where you're allowing someone who's potentially or is symptomatic to practice, right? Or be around people or travel with the team. So, like, we're all still learning about these things. So I just don't like the idea of blaming people for a contagious virus that is spreading, that people don't know for sure, how it's going to impact each individual person who is infected, and not wanting to put their own people at risk. I mean, I thought Mike Norvell on Monday said it well, where he said, like, we're supposed to be taking care of these players. Like, we tell their parents that we are responsible for their health and safety. So again, it doesn't make sense why you would try to blame someone or, accuse someone of trying to get out of a game. I understand it was super last minute. I understand that maybe a similar situation occurred and the other team signed off on it, but there's a reason all these protocols are in place. And that, I mean, it's going to get a little bit jargony here, but they have medical people on each campus that have to sign attestations to ensure that both sides are comfortable playing games, for a reason. This stuff is implemented for a reason. So for me, I think we should all be honestly grateful when games get in. And this was my problem with what Dan Mullen earlier in the season, when he was complaining about the lack of a home field advantage. It's like, this was no guarantee that these games were going to get played in the first place. And so we've jumped ship from that to appreciating the opportunity to play, to now, accusing teams or administrations of ducking opponents or whatever it might be during the worst phase of the pandemic. So that's where I stand on it. I can't get too worked up about blaming people during this.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed where I was on it. The couple of things I wrote were, folks, this is what you signed up for. It kind of speaks back to your Mullen point. Like, we were told from jump that this was going to be really messy and a lot of disruptions and very hard. And it has been every bit that. So the idea to listen, it is totally fair and I can totally get Clemson's side of it and Dabo Swinney's side of it of being pissed, right? Of being literally pissed off that you went all the way to Tallahassee and didn't play a football game, but to publicly put the other school on blast because of that seems a bit immature. The other part I would say is, you're going to all of these things, as we've talked about before, Nicole, there is some subjectiveness. There are some judgment calls, right, that are going to be made here. So the idea that one set of medical folks say, no, this is good, we should play, and another set says, not totally comfortable with that, is not unprecedented. That's sort of what goes on all the time in these situations, because you can set every protocol in the world, but there's never going to be a protocol that covers every situation in a black and white way. Ultimately, you're still going to be asking a doctor or an epidemiologist to say, what do you think? And in this case, the two people thought two different things, and we ended up with this situation. Again, I'm with you. I just don't like the blame game, and I don't like publicly putting people on blast. Like, you can do it privately. You can be pissed off privately. But I think to basically accuse your conference mate of bad faith, it just seems, I don't know what the point of that is, frankly.
Right. And again, And I know we've both talked to Dr. Jim Borchers, who is the co-chair of the Big Ten medical group. And honestly, like after speaking with him, I understand why everyone in that league raves about him, because he explains COVID better than anyone I've talked to. And you and I both talked to epidemiologists and immunologists through this too. But one thing he has said to me, and I don't think that people have focused on this enough, is if I erred on the side of caution, I'm okay with that. And that's, I think in this situation, that's the entire argument from Florida State's side. Like, if that's what it came down to, then they're fine with that. And that's absolutely fine in a pandemic. Like, that's totally fine. So I'm totally with you. I don't see what it accomplishes. We haven't seen a head coach do that, especially like you said, someone in your own conference, and like, it's just going to have awkward meetings, coaches meetings, administrator meetings. Like, you just don't do that in these types of situations. And especially like, Clemson's fine. They're going to have enough games to get consideration for the college football playoff. Like, it is fine. Like, it is just such a strange hill to die on and make a mountain out of a molehill, whichever, cliche I want to use here. But it was so strange that became such a big thing. And again, it's going to linger now because you did this to a conference mate.
Okay, so we just to state again, I stated this in the opening, but I want to make sure people understand. We are recording this on Monday afternoon. Like a lot of folks, we have Thanksgiving this week, which means you're trying to cram a lot of work into 2 or 3 days. So we are going to talk about the playoff rankings before the playoff rankings come out. Now, we all know that Alabama is going to be number 1. We all know that Notre Dame is probably going to be 2, maybe 3, probably 2. There's some uncertainty about Ohio State, maybe because they only have so many games, but we have a pretty good idea of what a lot of the rankings are going to look like. So I'm not necessarily, so we're going to talk sort of about what the rankings might look like, but then we're also going to sort of spin ahead because again, we all have a somewhat of a sense here of what the rankings might look like. And we don't necessarily need to see them to spin ahead to scenarios and how this thing could play out. What is, when you're sort of jotting down, what's the thing I want to see tomorrow night? Like, okay, so again, this is Monday. We're talking on Monday. They will be out Tuesday. If you're talking like pre-rankings, Nicole, what are the 2 or 3 things that you say, I am interested in this. This could be significant. And I'm not exactly sure. I know Alabama is going to be number 1, but I'm not exactly sure about this. So this is what I'm interested in.
Well, funny you ask that because I am brushing off and doing pre-college football rankings questions again. So I actually have 4 ready to go. But I think the 2 that are most interesting to me are where are Cincinnati and BYU slotted? Because we never quite know until that first rankings exactly how much is going to match up with like the AP poll and the coaches poll and like how the rest of the college football landscape that starts this in the preseason, how that stuff lines up. And it's definitely clear as good of teams that there are in the group of 5 this year, that there are some benefits to having played earlier and starting earlier, people seeing them more this year, maybe not having certain records or potential blowout losses by certain teams in certain leagues against Power 5 opponents. So I would like to see where those 2 teams stack up and how the committee sees them, because I think that will inform the way that the narrative shifts and is around Cincinnati and or BYU. Obviously, whether or not Cincinnati has a legit shot at the playoff. And then with BYU, they can't have that group of 5 champions slot in the New Year's Six. So where are they? Are they in that top 12? Or are they going to kind of need to be aggressive scheduling and try to get a Pac-12 game? So that's my main question. And then my second main question is, how is the committee going to look at these teams that have played vastly different amounts of games, right? Because we feel pretty confident that Ohio State is going to be in that top 4. But what if the committee decides that they just haven't seen enough yet? Like maybe they think they could get there, or we don't know. And we know that that's going to be a factor. We know they've acknowledged it. They're going to evaluate the resumes as of, the day they do the rankings. But I am curious. And then, obviously corollary of that is the Pac-12, which are going to have the least amount of games. So I am curious because we've never really seen that drastic a difference. We've only really seen teams that played 12 games versus 13 at the end of the season. This is very different.
Okay, let's get into BYU UC for a second, because that was the other sort of controversy with two schools via, leaking information to reporters, sort of sniping at each other. Not quite as bad as Clemson and Florida State, because it wasn't quite as serious. But take UC aside, let's talk about BYU. BYU was offered a chance to play Washington. I know that for a fact. That's been reported elsewhere. There were talks. There was some discussions about, hey, Washington understood that they were going to have an open date because the Apple Cup was not going to be able to come off, and reached out to BYU and said, hey, what you got going on? We see you're free this weekend. And again, as of Monday, that doesn't look like that's going to happen. And again, a little bit of like, hey, you said anywhere, anytime, anybody, BYU, why aren't you taking this game? But, frankly, there are some parameters that BYU has to hit to play this game, as far as testing, as far as going on the road, as far as being open-minded to the fact that 2 or 3 days into the week, Washington might get a Pac-12 team to play. So then the game is off. So for whatever reason, game doesn't go on. Do you think, and let me put it this way. Do you think it was wise of BYU before the rankings come out to say, you know what, we'd like to see where we are before we start diving on games against unranked Pac-12 teams?
I absolutely think that's reasonable. I think that we have gotten to a place in the season now where, again, it's like this baseline of appreciating when games are getting played has now shifted to like this God-given right to have games. And so now when games are postponed, we see, and again, now we saw that it is physically possible to schedule a game on a Friday and play it on Sunday. We've seen that. It wasn't the best game because these poor GAs and the game prep, obviously, but it is physically possible to do that. However, it is not always wise to do that. But every single time we see a postponement, and this happened the week that SEC had 4 postponements, it's happened in other leagues when there's been multiple ones, people immediately, again on Twitter, so not in real life, not the athletic directors, although I'm sure they're having exploratory calls, they immediately go, well, those 2 teams are free, let's play. It's been 3 days out, like they should play. And that's not always a great idea. And I think,
realistic,
or realistic. And again, in terms of preparation, in terms of like physical readiness, especially when, some of these programs, you have people coming in or heading into outbreaks, or coming out of outbreaks into outbreaks, right? Like you have certain issues going on. And again, like the actual preparation for these games, which make it safe to play. Like the reason that these leagues implemented a 53-man minimum, is for a physical safety standpoint, right? Like it's so that you're not putting, a 17-year-old scrawny kid who hasn't been in the gym on the offensive line. So like all of these other pieces have to come into consideration. So I don't blame BYU, who, by the way, also has an open date on December 5th for seeing how they come in the first rankings, what work they might need to do. And then, you know what? There's probably going to be at least one Pac-12 team looking for a game on December 5th.
Well, and there's also an interesting team with an open date on December 5th, and that is Cincinnati, right?
Also true.
Yeah, and listen, I've heard from Cincinnati's side of things that from their standpoint, they want to see, because immediately when we saw Cincinnati and BYU have open dates, and again, those open dates only came to be within the last few days because the AAC needed to do some schedule shuffling. So, of course, once that pops up, I was one of the first ones who pointed it out on Twitter. Hey, look at that. Both of these teams have off on December 5th. What do you say, UC and BYU? But again, knowing that it's not that easy. So Cincinnati, I think, also would like to see where it stands in the playoff rankings before it commits to anything. Because, conceivably, if Cincinnati is sitting at 12 Tuesday night, it's not making the playoff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, its main concern has to be only getting that group of 5 spot in a New Year's Six bowl. To do that, it means winning its championship. There's not a lot of benefit to Cincinnati playing BYU on December 5th. The week before, it's about to start most likely a home and home against Tulsa that will decide its conference championship. Like if BYU, it may sound great. It would certainly be entertaining for Cincinnati and BYU to play. But again, if I'm Cincinnati and I'm sitting at 12, that game is not getting me to 4. So why am I going to put my team on the line against a good, BYU team, risk Desmond Ridder getting hurt and then blowing up my chances to get to a big game that I have a reasonable chance of making? So I think both sides in that situation, and that game could end up being made. I still think that game could end up being made, depending on where things stand after Tuesday night.
Yeah, and again, like, to me, this is reasonable. Both of these programs are having great seasons. Like, there is a lot of value in finishing a season undefeated if you're these schools. Even if, again, BYU, Tom Holmoe, it was a miracle that he didn't have a schedule for this team to play. They lost every game on their schedule except 2. They had a bunch of Power 5 opponents on there. We don't know how that would have gone, but I just think that you have to be really smart if you're in those positions, because like you said, if it's not worth it to get, for Cincinnati, if it's not worth it to get close to the top 4, or for BYU to get into the New Year's Six realm, I don't see the point in playing that, because you're already having a great season. Your fan bases are pumped. There's a lot of value in just having a great season.
Yeah, listen, if BYU is number 10 on Tuesday night, then it's probably in pretty good position just to play its last game against San Diego State and, hold on to that ranking. And that ranking probably is good enough in this year. And without getting, because I know the playoff stuff and what bowl games are available can get like head spinning. Just take it from me, this is a good year for at-large teams. There's a lot of space. There's a lot of available spaces for those teams this year. So the committee is going to have to find about 4 to 6 of those type of teams, as opposed to being locked into a bunch of Power 5 conference champions this year. So, again, if I'm Cincinnati and I'm sitting at, or BYU and I'm sitting at 10, I really don't have a chance to get into the playoff no matter what I do with a Cincinnati game or anything else. Maybe it's best just to, to hold it, right? You got Delta 17 or an 18. You're not hitting on that. You're just going to hold it and hope that wins you the hand. And I think that's where BYU is right now, too. Now, again, I would love to watch BYU play some better teams and play Washington. But this is like fantasy schedule maker. Like, this is not real life.
Yes, and that's what. Again, like when you have these postponements happening on like a Wednesday or Thursday, and then people just saying these 2 teams should play, like that isn't real life. And I know that everyone's trying to get in as many games as possible this year, but you also like have to take into account a lot of considerations. So again, like, I understand that the BYU Washington thing was there were a lot of hot takes, there were a lot of opinions, there was a lot of information being floated out there. But I couldn't get that worked up about it, because I just think it makes all the sense in the world to wait until the first rankings. If they had come out last week and BYU knew where it stood, I think you possibly have a different resolution to that. But like, again, it's a risk to lock yourself into something if you don't know for sure if you need it, or if it would help, or again, if there's an injury risk, or if there's, just again, the things that you're striving for as a program just aren't available. I also think that it's just worth pointing out that like a quarterback saying that we'll go anywhere and play anyone, or a social media account doing that isn't like, those aren't the people making the decisions. Just wanted to point that out.
Right.
People seem to forget that.
Yeah, very important thing that the quarterback is not the AD and he can say anything he wants. And Zach Wilson can wear anything on his headband. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen.
And it's great. I mean, listen, I love Zach Wilson. I want him to be a Heisman finalist. It's a great message. But again, it's not always taken literally by the decision makers.
So how do you see this thing lining up behind sort of like there's a very obvious scenario here for the playoff. The super obvious, it's like the simple solution, right? The simple solution is Alabama wins out, Notre Dame and Clemson play again, and Clemson wins in the ACC championship game. Neither of those teams lose before that. Clemson wins, and Ohio State. I think Ohio State's still in a position where if it just wins out and blows everybody out, though it struggled a little bit against Indiana. So the simple solution, I believe, is Ohio State wins out, Alabama wins out, Clemson wins out, Notre Dame loses to Clemson in the ACC championship game. Some version of those four teams get into some order of those four teams get into the playoff. But when you start looking at like, okay, where are the landmines? What if the simple things don't work out? What are some of the non-simple things that have you wondering, like, I wonder if this happens, or if this happens, what's plan B?
Okay, so the interesting scenarios, because I'm with you, which is I think part of the reason there's just so much energy around like BYU and Cincinnati is we're kind of tired of talking about the same teams. So even that fourth spot isn't as exciting as certain other years. Plus, you already have like the Big 12 and the Pac-12 not in the picture. Okay, so here are a couple wrinkles. Let's go through the ACC championship game. What if it is a blowout? Mm-hmm. Does that
Clemson blows out Notre Dame?
Yes.
You mean? Or what if?
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. First of all, if Clemson loses, they're not in the playoff because they would have gotten swept.
Two losses is probably going to be the
end. And that would actually be an interesting scenario because I guess at that point you're thinking Florida gets elevated to that fourth spot, probably.
Unless Florida gets beaten up,
unless they get
Alabama.
Blown out.
Right. In the championship game.
So that's
remember, Florida already got a loss.
Yes. Okay, so that's an interesting
it's
one.
A&M, right? It isn't A&M maybe the break glass in case of emergency team?
Yeah, and I guess it's going to depend on, again, and they've lost games. So it's like, again, it's like kind of how does the committee view the total number of games you get in? What about Clemson blows out Notre Dame?
Yeah.
Does Notre Dame get in?
See, I still think, as long as it takes care of business, obviously, and we'll get to this maybe later. North Carolina is going to be an interesting game for Notre Dame this weekend. I still think so, because I still think the version of Clemson that Notre Dame beat was not the full version, was not the 100% version of Clemson, but was a good enough version of Clemson that it will be hard to find another team that matches that win and that resume. But again, it becomes a little nuanced with, that would certainly open the door for, again, maybe an A&M or somebody like that on the outside. But I just don't know if we're going to have a ton of good options other than a one-loss Notre Dame that has beaten Clemson.
I think that's a good point, that it would be a win that no one else really has. And I think that's probably also where the Texas A&M, in case of emergency, break glass is, because they have that win over Florida. Mm-hmm. And I do think it would probably be taken into consideration. Those were home games. I do wonder, though, we know how the committee has said about injuries in the past, which I assume is they referred to this in their protocols as similar to how they're going to view player availability, presumably related to COVID. If a Clemson team that has Trevor Lawrence, as great as they played in South Bend, and obviously DJ put up some record-breaking numbers, but if with Trevor Lawrence at the end of the season, they blow out that same Notre Dame team that's healthy, presumably healthy, that's the team that the playoff is looking at and saying, these are the four teams, because they project, right? They want to know who's going to be available and healthy. And again, that's going to be impossible this year, but they want to have the best games possible. We've seen so many blowouts in the semifinals, and they're trying not to do that to us. They're trying to project the four best teams that could give us good games. So to me, if Clemson looks totally different, which again, I don't think they will, but if they do a very different result to the same team with the roster that they would be taking into the playoff, I do think you have to consider that a little bit differently. But I think you're right, because I think once you take Notre Dame out of the equation here and Florida, in this scenario, Florida loses the SEC championship game, you don't have a great fourth option. And again, this has been a problem that I just mentioned with these blowouts in these semifinal games. You know, Oklahoma has been in that fourth spot, and there's been blowouts. You've had teams from the Big Ten. Like, it's tough when we're clearly in an era where there are three powerhouse programs that just recruit and roll at a different level, and there's a drop off. And so, like, I would love Notre Dame to keep it really tight against Clemson, lose a tight game, so that they see, you know, we saw them beat Clemson, we saw them hang, like we think they're in that category, because otherwise it feels like we've seen this before.
Okay, I'm going to take a very quick break here. I want to get back to one of the things you said about the Pac-12 and bring them into this discussion. And we'll also talk a little bit about head-to-head and things along those lines and some other things that I might be kind of looking for when the rankings come out and where this thing might be heading in the long run. You're listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Back in a sec with Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic.
Hey, it's Michael Rosenbaum. You may remember me as Lex Luthor from the hit TV show Smallville. Regardless, I have this really cool podcast called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, where I get celebrities who are a lot more famous than me to really open up. Let's get inside of Jim Jeffries.
Oh, I never did anything with my life. I could have been a better son. Oh, God. I should apologize to this person.
So, join me on Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic is my guest on this Thanksgiving week. And we'll definitely talk some Thanksgiving too. Nicole, before we're out of here, we have to talk about what you're going to eat and whether Red is coming with you on your trip home and things along those lines, because that's all very, very important. But before we do that, I want to get into a little more of the playoff talk. You were very quick to say we're not going to really worry about the Pac-12, and I tend to agree with you. As an aside, you know, well, let's just leave it at that. I tend to agree with you. No aside necessary. But why do you think no? Like Oregon 7-0, USC 7-0? No, we're not. We're not going to go there. Like no chance. Do you think, especially if things get a little weird and you're sort of looking for another team?
Listen, I will never say never, but you're already starting from you're so far behind, right? Like it's sort of when you're imagining like a race or like, you know, a sprint or something and someone starts ahead of you, right? So you're already starting behind. There've been a lot of cancellations, so it's almost, you know, more challenging to kind of evaluate the quality of opponent in certain situations, and might be by the end. I mean, I'm not going to rule it out. I will say this is a subjective selection committee. They're humans. This is the whole point, that it's not computers deciding these things. I think that if you watched USC in the first 2 weeks, you think they are lucky that they won those games. Yeah. And things like game control and, you know, style points. These are things that matter when it's a human subjective selection committee. So I'll just say that about USC. I mean, I'm not going to say it's like totally impossible, but I will say, you know, we know that teams like in Ohio State were going to have to be perfect because they were going to have fewer data points. Ohio State lost a game. But I just think that it's hard to make up that ground unless you get a lot of help, unless there are, you know, more rashes of cancellations with other teams involved in the playoff hunt. So you're playing, you know, a much more comparable amount of games, because the way that I kept viewing it in my mind was to get in the same ballpark as everybody else. So to me, Ohio State could get in the same ballpark as everybody else so that they could be evaluated somewhat evenly. I don't think that way about Pac-12, but again, like the committee will tell us Tuesday night if they disagree with that sentiment. If they are more bullish on teams that haven't played that many games, that means that's not a sticking point for them. So that would put someone in the hunt, like an Oregon in the hunt, in a way that I personally have been dismissing them. But you're right. I mean, we literally just went through this scenario where if Clemson loses and gets knocked out, Florida loses, gets a second loss, like you're all of a sudden there's teams in consideration for the playoff that would not have been otherwise. And let's say Cincinnati is too far out or whatever it might be. You are going to need to look for teams, but I don't know. I mean, until the committee proves me otherwise, I'm still going to kind of just assume that it's just not enough. And also, again, like, yes, the committee changes year to year, but we have seen the way that they have evaluated Pac-12 champions in years past, and more years than not, they have not included them in the playoff. So there are some of those committee members that are on this year's committee.
Yeah, they haven't gotten the benefit of the doubt, the Pac-12. So the Buckeyes, when you said lost the game, just to clarify what Nicole is talking about.
Yes.
They lost. No, I understand. But what Nicole is talking about is they lost a game from their schedule. They lost the Maryland game. So the most games Ohio State will be able to play is 8. If they get to the conference championship game and win it. I'm interested in Ohio State, though, because somebody sort of framed this to me. In a normal season, again, if they had a lot of data points, Ohio State and really most teams would be given a mulligan. For example, I think if Alabama were to lose this weekend to Auburn, but they still go about their business, win the SEC championship, are very impressive on their way to winning the SEC championship, Alabama will almost certainly still make the playoff. So it could stub its toe once, win its conference, and still make the playoff. That's what happens in a normal season, quite frankly, anyway. It's funny, we will see these teams, we will often see teams lose games to teams that we think they're not supposed to during the regular season. Everybody gets on Twitter and says, that's going to eliminate them from the playoff, and it really doesn't.
Oh, you mean?
But I'm wondering about Ohio State, not
people's
just
reactions on Twitter.
Not just because of the number of games Ohio State is playing, but also because the Big Ten has cratered. Like the best team Ohio State is going to play, it just played in Indiana, and all of a sudden beating Penn State's not going to mean anything. Beating Michigan is not going to mean anything. Beating Michigan State, like these teams that would usually support Ohio State's schedule. So I'm wondering, does Ohio State have a mulligan? Can they lose a regular season game, still win the conference championship against, probably a pretty good Northwestern team and get in? My sense is probably yes, because again, we're running out of we have to have 4 teams, but I don't know.
So you're saying between the teams of Illinois, Michigan State, and Michigan? That's hard to, right? So like, I want to agree with you because we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, but my goodness, I mean, this is the challenge though, because when this division is down in a way that we haven't seen, where Penn State and Michigan are down and Michigan State is fully rebuilding, and again, Indiana is the second best team in the division, it's going to be really hard because usually you have so many built-in opportunities for like marquee games, marquee wins, and you don't have them, and you had a shortened schedule. And I mean, again, I think Northwestern's a good team. That defense is legitimate. That could be a challenge. Northwestern plays tight games. Like that could be a really quality opportunity in the championship game, but you just don't have any other feathers in your cap at that point except Indiana, right? Like I think the committee is going to evaluate that win over Indiana as a really, really good win, but like it's just so strange because I think that when we baked in this assumption that no matter when Ohio State started, and especially once we got the start date, they would get enough games in, I think we baked in that they would have more quality wins because it's the Big Ten East, and that didn't happen. So that is strange. That is a strange element. I just looking at the teams left on the regular season schedule, I don't know how you could take a team that lost to one of them. Like Ohio State, of all programs, has had those bad losses keep them out before. Yeah.
And again, I understand. I'm walking into the land of unicorns and fairies when I start talking about Ohio State losing to Illinois, this Michigan team and that Michigan State team. Like they're going to be, I think they're 28-point favorites against Illinois. They're going to be 20-odd point favorites against all these teams. But again, I'm asking you to suspend disbelief here, listeners, for just a moment and picture a world in which Ohio State stumbles. I don't know, maybe Justin Fields gets hurt on the first play, right? It's not that it wipes him out for the season, but it wipes him out for the game and things get squirrely and all of a sudden Ohio State loses one of those games.
Are you just trying to come up with a scenario where Oregon makes the playoff here? Because all of these scenarios, this is all the type of help the Pac-12 would actually need. They would need chaos.
But it also brings me, let's go back to Cincinnati for just a second, because one of the things that I think that the reason why I believe like Cincinnati could be hopeful here, especially if it lands in, let's say, the 8 spot. Let's say Cincinnati ends up 8 Tuesday night. I don't think you have to really stretch your imagination to all of a sudden say like, oh, wait a second, Clemson gets swept, get rid of Clemson. Florida loses to Alabama, get rid of Florida. Let's say Texas A&M. First of all, I wouldn't put Texas A&M ahead of Cincinnati anyway if Cincinnati were to win out. But let's just say Texas A&M takes an L against LSU. I don't think that's crazy. As bad as LSU has played this year, that's still a team with a lot of talent. I think it's conceivable. So in other words, I could easily pick off like 3 or 4 teams ahead of Cincinnati, and all of a sudden the committee, we're like daring the committee. Like I dare you to not put them in at 10-0, right? With a conference championship, or 11-0. I think they might even be able to get to 11 games. So that's why I think where UC starts off is so important, because if they're close, the committee is sort of saying like, okay, they're viable. We just got to get some of the teams in front of them. And again, getting some of those teams in front of them knocked off is not a crazy stretch of the imagination.
I agree. And I would love to see it. And I think that this is what happens after we had multiple years of having the conversations about UCF. This is another team in that conference. There is a lot of national respect for that league as a whole. The offenses, the defenses, when they're good, they're among the country's best. The coaches in that league, among the country's best, rising stars. We always talk about them for big jobs, or they go to big jobs. So the respect has been building. The defense is legit in a year that a lot of traditional defensive powerhouses are not as legit. And it's weird to say this, and I mentioned this earlier, but in a year where so many of the power leagues decided to not play non-conference games, or only play one, it had to be in state, whatever, with restrictions, it almost helped the group of 5 leagues not to play those games, which is counterintuitive, because usually we think that they need to play multiple games like that and win them to have a resume strong enough to make the playoff. This year, they're getting the benefit of the doubt because of the amount of games they've played, and they don't have like an opportunity that could have been a loss. Like it's almost interesting. And again, we'll see if the committee views it that way, but I feel like that's been a huge selling point with the national, respect, attention, the way that teams like a Coastal Carolina and all of these teams are in the polls. It's helped them that those leagues did not. I mean, and again, the Sun Belt, beat the Big 12, beat up on the Big 12, which obviously helped, and that became a narrative. But everyone else, that hurt the Big 12. But everyone else, you didn't have those opportunities where teams, maybe got blown out or lost a tough game, and now you have more undefeated teams. You have teams that are doing things like Coastal's doing for the first time ever, right? And so it's interesting. And then you had Liberty almost go 3-0 against the ACC. So in those rare situations when it happened, when there was that crossover, the group of 5 teams did well. And just the narrative feels very different than it normally would when maybe those types of teams would have had a loss or two before entering conference play.
Yeah, so on Sunday night, or Sunday afternoon, the College Football Playoff put out its own little Q&As. And to sum it up, basically the College Football Playoff was just trying to tell everybody in advance, we're not changing anything. It's basically situation normal, or we're going to try to treat this as normal as possible, right? We're going to have the same amount of teams. We're going to judge them the same. We're even going to meet in person for some reason.
Yeah, that was not in the Q&A, but that was a question that everybody has. why?
Yeah. And honestly,
doing this?
other than that, everything like that, to me, that's the craziest thing. I
Yes.
understand trying to keep everything as normal as possible because, frankly, there's no good solution to make this abnormal season normal. No matter tweaking protocols or expanding the playoff wasn't realistic, pushing it back, all those things. We all knew those weren't going to happen. You know, a really crazy thing is the fact that they're actually going to meet in person.
Yes.
I think that's silly. But I say all that because, again, the playoff is trying to treat things as normal as possible, but you're removing a whole bunch of quote unquote data points, and the double-edged sword to the especially to the group of 5 teams is, hey, we can't judge you against these other conferences, but maybe that helps. Maybe because now you don't have the losses, right? The possible losses. Because it's more subjective than ever, maybe it has to go to the eye test, and maybe the committee is a little more forgiving of as far as, strength of schedule, because there aren't these. I think it's going to be a problem for BYU. I think BYU basically playing a Conference USA schedule is the reason why they're not really going to be in the playoff, quote unquote, Final Four discussion. But for Cincinnati, again, that league has, as you said, built up a ton of credibility. Now, Memphis is not quite as good as it has been. UCF has lost 3 times. Houston is not quite as good as it has been. So a little of the shine is taken off, but I would also suggest that happens in all the leagues, right, this year, as you're only looking at conference play. And just because Memphis took a bunch of AAC losses doesn't mean the AAC is not good, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And also, again, it's not even just the top teams, like the middle tier teams, could have picked up losses in non-conference play. I think it's going to be a huge boost to Cincinnati. And again, this is a league, and these are opponents and teams and units that the committee has shown a certain level of respect for. And we've had these conversations about UCF, and this is the same league. And so I just think that there's going to be things that are pulling in Cincinnati's direction regarding the uniqueness of this year. So I'm hoping that's right. And that's why that is the number one thing that I'm curious about with the first rankings.
Okay, so it's rivalry weekend. We're not going to get into like every game here because we've already talked for a while. Auburn, Alabama, it's the Iron Bowl, but it's not really rivalry weekend. It's always tricky because there's no Ohio State, Michigan. And there's no territorial cup, right? Like it's just another thing that, like, every once in a while, like I fluctuate, Nicole, between being very happy that we're getting a football season in to at times being sad because football season it's missing so many things that I normally enjoy. And as much as we have a really great slate of games this weekend, hopefully most of them get played. Clearly not all of them will. And there's a lot of interesting things. Like there's something missing on a Thanksgiving weekend because traditionally that's when this has become the weekend. Now I know for years it wasn't, but over the last 10 or 15 years, that's when we get all the rivalries. That's when we get Michigan and Ohio State and so many of the cool rivalries, in-state rivalries that we've come to love. And so I'm very happy that we have what we have, but I'm also finding myself being a little bit sad that it's not what we usually get.
Well, and I think too, it's also it's thrown me off about like what time of year we're in, right? Yes. Like when you're like, oh, well, Utah just had their season opener, but wait, it's late November. Okay, what does that mean? We also don't have the Apple Cup this week. So like you're saying it's rivalry week, that doesn't even register to me. Like it just doesn't feel that way. And like also we just have so many more regular season games to get in before the finish line. And then plus we're going to have that crazy week in at least 2 of the leagues that are doing the challenges between like, the first place teams playing the championship game, then the second place teams in each division. Plus you're going to have SEC makeup games, ACC makeup games. Like there's going to be a lot of regular season games happening championship weekend too. So it just feels like we're still so far to go in the season, whereas usually like rivalry week is the end. And so like all of that's weird, and also it's causing me to have a lot of trouble keeping track of the calendar and also what number week we're in, because we're in like different numbers of weeks depending on which league you're in, and then also college football as a whole. It's been very confusing for those of us who haven't really thought about math in a while.
Yeah, your bio. I imagine this happens for fans too, but maybe even more so when you work in it and your career is tied to it, and literally your calendar, your day-to-day calendar is tied to it. But biorhythms have been totally thrown off by this sports schedule, right? Like I am all over the joint. The idea that I might have to actually buy a Christmas gift soon is just bananas. I cannot wrap my head around that. So I'm sure my wife and child will be very disappointed in me this Christmas. They tend to be anyway, but I think this will be even more so. Let me ask you this. So it's Thanksgiving. Is there a Auerbach family traditional part of the meal, separate from what we all normally do, turkey stuffing, blah, 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 that you are looking forward to? Or maybe, I don't want to assume anything. Maybe your Thanksgiving has been thrown off a little bit by the pandemic, but is there something that you usually look forward to on the Auerbach family Thanksgiving meal that is a little different from what, everybody else's meal is?
Well, so it is interesting, and we've talked about this off air, but I was not going to go home for Thanksgiving because the CDC is telling us not to. And then we had a death in the family. And so I'm actually in New Jersey. Red did make the trip because he's incredibly important for grieving and mourning. He cheers everybody up.
Red is Nicole's small dog.
Yes, he's now 5.5 years old now. Bichon
But
Yorkie.
Red always looks like a puppy. Red will always look. Red actually doesn't just look like a puppy. Red looks like a stuffed animal.
Yes,
he's very adorable.
He does. So he made the trip because that was the most important part. So we actually are going to do Thanksgiving. But what's interesting is I actually made my first turkey this year for a very, very small Friendsgiving with 2 people in my pod over the weekend. And which by the way, highly recommend making a turkey for 3 people because then you get all the leftovers. But I am so proud of myself right now for being able to do it. And I might have to do it again because my mom has just been kind of all over the place this week. So I'm kind of now like confident, borderline cocky about making a turkey. So wow. I know that is the centerpiece for everybody, but I have to say I made it the way that my mom does with the same like rubs and spices and brining that she does. And it's phenomenal. And then other than that, my favorite side dish is my grandma's recipe for a corn souffle. Also very easy. But everyone loves it. So that's always the biggest hit. We always have to make 2 in a normal year when we have a lot of people. This year, it'll just be my immediate family. So honestly, we'll probably still make 2 of the corn souffles.
That's interesting. So corn souffle. So let me see, because one of the cool things that, I don't know if it's getting made this year because it's usually my sister's thing and we're not doing a really expanded Thanksgiving. It's going to be a little smaller, is cornbread stuffing, which might have a little bit like a corn souffle thing going on. But again, it's a little more like cornbread-ish with, actually, it's not even cornbread stuffing. It's cornbread. It's called cornbread bread pudding. So it's got a bread pudding feel to it, which could be a little souffle-ish. My daughter thinks it thinks it tastes a little too much like dessert, so she tends not to eat it with the meal. But I love it. I think it goes great with gravy. So that's the one thing. Again, it's not crazy outside the box.
You need to make it.
This is family thing.
There is no pressure here for you to attempt that. If it's a smaller gathering, if
pressure in cooking,
no,
pressure in cooking.
No, this year there's no pressure because it's not the big deal. You're not going to be like embarrassing yourself in front of however many people you normally do Thanksgiving. You should get the recipe and try it.
The act of cooking is always pressure filled for me. I always feel very stressed when I cook.
I find it very therapeutic.
It's good to be that way. I the act of eating is therapeutic. The act of cooking, I always find rather stressful.
All right, I still think you should try.
Looking forward to the eating. Yeah.
I think you should try it. No pressure.
I did have a discussion with Sally yesterday as we were taking a little walk about the idea. Like I should, like, again, we have a small gathering, and I said I will look over what we have and decide if there's something that in particular that I would like, and maybe I will cook it. Now, there's a very good chance that I will end up not doing that. But I did at least bring that to the conversation. I sort of threw the idea out there that I will make something that not just I would like, that other people would like too, but nonetheless, the thing that the idea has been brought to bear. I don't know if I will go through with it.
This is what's going to happen. As soon as we finish this podcast, I'm going to send you the corn souffle recipe. You cannot mess it up. It's like 5 ingredients, and you just put it in the oven.
I do like corn. I'm a big fan of corn. It's
very easy. I'm going to send it to you. You're going to impress people, and I promise you can't mess it up.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. I may go about doing that. Listen, first of all, condolences to your family, you and your family. Try to have a good Thanksgiving. Please give Red a pet for me because I'm a big fan of Red. And enjoy the football. Appreciate you breaking everything down playoff-wise and everything else that's going on this weekend. It should be a good weekend for football. Again, I hope you get a chance to, with all that's going on this weekend, to enjoy some of the football as well.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. And again, a silver lining is, our family actually gets to be together. So it's a pretty big one this year.
Happy Thanksgiving, Nicole.
Happy Thanksgiving, Ralph.
And now 3 and out. First down. JT Daniels debuted for Georgia this past weekend, and it was quite a thing. The USC transfer passed for 401 yards, and the Bulldogs beat Mississippi State. That led to a lot of questions about what took so long for Kirby Smart to put Daniels in the lineup, since the quarterback coming off a knee injury has been medically cleared to play since the second week of the SEC season. So I'm going to give Smart the benefit of the doubt in this situation. Just because a player is cleared to play doesn't mean he is necessarily ready to be the player he needs to be to play effectively and to protect himself on the field. You cannot convince me that Smart and the Georgia staff saw a fully functional Daniels who they felt was ready to play in games and simply left him on the bench because the assessment was Stetson Bennett is a better player. I just don't buy that. And Georgia beat writer Mike Griffith spoke to Daniels' father, who said that he was happy Smart brought his son along slowly. I'm sure thinking about what could have been if Daniels had been ready for the season is frustrating for Georgia fans. But to me, it doesn't sound like Smart made a poor evaluation. It sounds like he was playing it safe with a player coming back from a serious knee injury. Second down. I think there's going to be a lot of speculation down the stretch about Tennessee and Virginia Tech making coaching changes. Tennessee plays Vanderbilt this week and then has Florida and A&M. 3-7 is a very real possibility for Jeremy Pruitt in year 3. And oh boy, I would not want to be him if the Vols lose to Vandy. Still, Tennessee just gave Pruitt a contract extension. And he is Phil Fulmer's guy. Fulmer, by the way, also received a contract extension earlier this year. For Tennessee to blow out this coaching staff after only 3 years and then let Fulmer do another search sounds beyond dysfunctional and downright irresponsible. But dysfunctional and irresponsible is not a bad way to sum up Tennessee football for much of the last couple of decades. As for Virginia Tech, it would be pretty easy to write this season off as a COVID wreck and cut Justin Fuente some slack. The Hokies got off to a 4-2 start, but let games against Liberty and Miami slip away and then got blasted by Pitt in a loss that had the scent of a team that may have checked out. It's not going to get better on December 5th when the Hokies play Clemson, which leaves the Virginia game as a chance to salvage their season. The bigger picture is there just hasn't been much progress in the program under Fuente. His best seasons came in his first couple of seasons as Frank Beamer's successor. The buyout situation for Fuente, I believe, is about $8 million, which amazingly would be considered reasonable in ordinary times, not quite so much in pandemic financial crunch times. I don't think the Hokies will fire Fuente, but I do wonder if another opportunity comes open for him, if both he and the school jump at the chance to move on from one another. Third down. This is a very unscientific assessment on my part, but I'm finding it difficult to judge the quality of teams in the Pac-12. Sort of relates back to our conversation with Nicole. I'm just not sure what I'm seeing. The combination of the season starting so late, plus various restrictions being placed on the teams that influence preparation has me wondering if any of what I'm seeing from these teams is truly meaningful. Now, again, that's a combination of eye test and probably a little baked in bias based on what I know going into this season. Maybe I was predisposed to thinking that this Pac-12 season was going to be particularly messy and can't get past that. But over the first few weeks, it has looked to me that in the Pac-12, the quality of football is a greater distance from normal than in the other Power 5 conferences. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good, and happy Thanksgiving, Sarah. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcasts. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.